All right, welcome to CCN 2.0 and to the tutorials. So we didn't have tutorials last year. This is our first year of doing tutorials, and so today you're going to get a tour of computational cognitive science by two of the superstars from that field, Ann Collins and Sam Gershman. And I think with sort of very complementary directions or takes on the questions. Ann did her PhD in Paris and then a postdoc at Brown with Michael J. Frank, and for the last couple years has been on the faculty at Berkeley. Sam did a PhD at Princeton, a postdoc at MIT, and has been on the faculty at Harvard now for a few years. And so whereas Ann comes at these questions from a more kind of neurally inspired modeling approach, Sam comes at it from more of a sort of probabilistic modeling approach. And so today I think you'll get to see some way how those two different approaches can sort of go after some of the same questions. So I guess join me in welcoming Sam first.
All right, thanks Russ. Glad to be here. So let me just say a few words about how this is going to work. So I'm going to do the first part for the first hour and a half, then we'll have a break, and then Ann will do the second part. And the way that we've divided it, broadly speaking, is that I'm going to talk about the growth of knowledge, and she's going to talk about the growth of skills. So I'm going to talk mostly about sort of passive observation, how do we learn about the structure of the world, and she's going to talk about how do we learn structure of the world that's actually actionable, that we can do something with, okay? And the other thing I wanted to say is that it would be great if you guys interrupted me as much as you wanted, and I don't really I could speak for hours and hours, but I don't have to, and I'm even more happy to field your questions, okay? All right, so let me start with a story. This is a story about Marco Polo. So Marco Polo visited Java, and he encountered a rhinoceros there. The problem is that Marco Polo didn't actually know what a rhinoceros was. He had no concept of a rhinoceros. No European had ever observed a rhinoceros. The closest thing that he could think of was a unicorn, sort of like what a unicorn looks like on a medieval tapestry. So the question for Marco Polo here is this a funny-looking unicorn, or is this some fundamentally new thing in the world that I have to create a new concept for? Okay? So just to drive this point home, so we can think about parameter learning as basically trying to fit the rhino into the unicorn space, right? So what parameters do I have to change in the unicorn space to get something that looks like a rhino? Whereas structure learning is the problem of figuring out what are the spaces to begin with, right? So what is the unicorn space and what is the rhino space? And when should we create an entirely new space to accommodate some surprising observation, okay? So really Marco Polo's problem is our problem. It's the problem of what's out there. What's out there in the world, right? We're not born having all the structures that we need, all the structural knowledge to apprehend the concepts that we have to learn in our everyday lives. And so the purpose of this tutorial is to explain some of the formal machinery for how we could model this kind of structure learning and then apply it to a bunch of different domains in cognition and neuroscience. Okay. So let me just give you a few examples of the kind of structures that I'm talking about. So one very basic thing is the problem of clustering. So imagine you saw data that looked like this, but you didn't get to see these colored ellipses. You just saw a scatter plot of dots. How do we figure out how many clusters are in this data, right? That's a lot like Marco Polo's problem. What's out there? How many things are out there, right? But we can go beyond that, right? So we could talk about features. So many objects like faces, for example, and natural images could be appropriately decomposed into a set of features, but how do I figure out what those features are? Where do they come from? How many features should I posit based on the data? We can also talk about structural form in the context of graphs. So we can take different kinds of data like taxonomic data, facial data, geographic data, voting data, and organize it into different graph topologies that reflect the underlying structure, right? So for example, two-dimensional face data could naturally fall into 2 dimensions, whereas taxonomic data could naturally fall into a tree structure. So this is work by Charles Kemp and Josh Tenenbaum showing how to extract this kind of structure automatically from data. Another context in which this comes up is function learning. So if I see, let's say in this case, a one-dimensional function, I could try to fit polynomial functions of various orders, right? So I could fit a flat function or a linear function or a quadratic function or even something higher order. And the structural learning question in that context is, what functional form should I use? right? So the big picture here is that Bayes' rule, which I'll get into in a second, tells us how to infer hypotheses given data, right? So everyone's kind of familiar with that tool. But where do the hypotheses come from in the first place? Where does the hypothesis space come from over which Bayes' rule is operating? And one of the key points here is that actually Bayes' rule can operate over hypothesis spaces in exactly the same way that it operates over individual hypotheses, and we just have to formulate the inference problem in the right way. And I'll show you some examples of how that works. One important ingredient for this formalism is non-parametric Bayesian statistics, non-parametric Bayesian models. And we're going to use this area of statistics to derive priors over unbounded or even infinite hypothesis spaces. And an important facet of these models is that although they're unbounded, they can accommodate possibly infinite dimensional complexity, they have preferences for simpler structures. And so I'll give you some examples of that as well. So why do we call it non-parametric Bayes? It's actually kind of a confusing terminology because in some sense it does have parameters. But what makes it non-parametric is that the number of parameters grows with the data. And we can understand this we can put this into context by comparing it to classical non-parametric models and also parametric models. So just to illustrate, let's imagine that we have some data here, one-dimensional data, so the x's represent the data points. Now a parametric model, a parametric density model would try to fit a distribution over these data that comes from some finite dimensional functional family. So for example, here I'm fitting a mixture of Gaussians, so the parameters of this model correspond to the means and variances of these two Gaussians and some weighting parameter that tells me how often one of those Gaussians is sampled, right? A non-parametric density model, which is shown in the middle, as its name suggests, it doesn't have some fixed set of parameters. What it does instead is it basically plops down a Gaussian for every data point, and then it models the density as a mixture over those Gaussians. What makes it non-parametric is that every time you add a new data point, you're effectively adding a new parameter. Okay? The non-parametric Bayes, non-parametric Bayesian models are somewhere in between. So it's not necessarily going to create a new Gaussian for every data point that you encounter, but in theory it could. Instead, what it's going to do is try to adaptively allocate new data points to particular Gaussian components and creating new components only when it encounters something that's really unusual. And that's what's shown here. And I'll show you more formally what this actually entails in a few moments. Okay? So the building blocks of this tutorial that I'm going to talk about are basically fall into three classes. One are mixture models, where we're going to apply those to clustering. And there we're going to use a non-parametric Bayesian model called the Chinese restaurant process. And I'll explain why it has that weird culinary metaphor. The second are latent feature models, and we're going to use those to do a kind of non-parametric model of factor analysis. And there, the prior over feature spaces corresponds to the Indian buffet process. And then I'm going to talk about function learning, where we're solving regression problems. And there, the prior over functions is going to be a Gaussian process. So I'll get into the details of all of this in a moment. Are there any questions so far about the big picture? Nope? OK. So let's jump right into it and talk about mixture models. All right, so let's go back to this picture that I showed you before. I'm going to try to use the terminology where I refer to components, or mixture components, as the thing in the world that's generating the data, and then your clusters are your inferences about those underlying components. So you don't get to directly observe the components. You can make inferences about them by clustering. So each cluster here corresponds to a mixture component, which is a distribution over data. In this case, these are Gaussian ellipses. So how do we identify these ellipses conditional on data? And that's where Bayes' rule comes in. So I'm going to use Z to denote the clustering. So Z represents the assignment of all these data points to one of these clusters, and X represents the data. So Bayes' rule tells us that we should multiply the likelihood of the data times the prior probability of the clustering. So this tells us how consistent are the data with the clustering that I've hypothesized, and this tells us a priori how plausible is that clustering under the prior. So So the Chinese restaurant process is a particular representation of that prior where which is useful in cases where you don't know the number of clusters a priori. So we can think about the Chinese restaurant process as a sequential stochastic process that generates an unbounded number of mixture components. So the way it works is this, and it's sometimes useful, although sometimes confusing, to appeal to this culinary metaphor that gives it its name. So the reason it's called the Chinese restaurant process is that the statisticians in Berkeley who invented it were impressed by the seemingly infinite seating capacity of Chinese restaurants in the Bay Area. And so they imagined a Chinese restaurant that had an infinite number of tables, and in theory, each table could seat an infinite number of individuals. So the customers in this metaphor are the data points that enter into the restaurant, and they get assigned to tables which correspond to mixture components. Okay? And the way it works is that the first customer comes in and gets seated at the first table, and then the second customer comes in and has to choose either to sit at the same table as the first customer or go to a new table. And the table assignments occur probabilistically, where the probability of sitting at a table is proportional to the number of people already sitting at that table, right? So the probability of a new data point getting assigned to an existing mixture component is proportional to the number of data points already assigned to that mixture component. So that's a kind of a rich gets richer scheme, and that's what gives it the simplicity bias. Because what that means is that the model is going to try to place as many people as possible, as many data points as possible into the same mixture component. And so mathematically, it looks like this. So T here is indexing data points. So the probability of assigning a particular data point to cluster K is proportional to the number of data points already assigned to that cluster. And there's this parameter alpha, which is known as the concentration parameter, which controls the complexity of the model. That is, it controls the probability of assigning a new data point to an entirely new cluster. We can think about kind of the limit cases to get some intuition for what alpha means. So when alpha goes to 0, you never create a new cluster. Everybody gets assigned to the same cluster. When alpha goes to infinity, you assign every new data point to a new cluster. So you basically get something that looks like the classical non-parametric density estimator. But then somewhere in between, you're going to get some number of tables. And in general, if you have n data points, then the expected number of clusters is going to be alpha log n. Okay? Now, just to stem any confusion that sometimes comes up here, some people get stuck on the fact that this doesn't depend on the data itself, like the properties of the data. Just keep in mind that this is the prior. Okay? This is the prior, and then the posterior is not going to have alpha log n clusters. The posterior is going to be conditional on the data and could have one cluster or many more clusters, depending on how complex the data are, right? Okay. Any questions so far? Yes?
To what extent is this stable depending on the ordering of the data?
So this is an exchangeable random process. So in principle, the reordering of the data don't matter. Now, there's non-exchangeable variants, and time series models have been built on non-exchangeable variants of this process, but I'm not going to get into that here. Yeah. Okay, so this is the end of the kind of technical introduction to the Chinese restaurant process. Now I want to show you how this can actually be applied to data and to cognition. And I'm going to show you a few different, we're going to see a few different examples here and also in Anne's talk. So I'm going to focus on an example in high-level cognition, which I'm going to refer to as social structure learning. So the basic idea is that individuals are organized into latent groups, and beliefs about latent groups are going to determine the social influences on decisions. Now, importantly, because latent groups are unobservable by definition, people have to reason about them, and I'm going to claim that they reason about them probabilistically. So just to give you some sense of why this is important, I think we all know that social information is very influential in determining our decisions. It determines what movies we see, what music to listen to, what food to eat. And this is true all across the animal kingdom. So here are two Norway rats sniffing each other's breath. And depending on what they smell, that could introduce a very long-lasting food preference that could last for weeks. And this has also been studied in social psychology. For example, one idea has been that social influence is stronger from similar than from dissimilar others. That's pretty intuitive. there's a well-known study by Brock that showed that a salesman who reported his paint consumption to be similar to a customer's sold more paint to that customer. Now, although this is intuitive, there's actually some subtle challenges for this kind of notion of similarity, right? So let me try to articulate what would be a kind of an intuitive baseline account of social influence. So I'm going to call this the dyadic similarity model. So imagine that this person, the way this person is going to make decisions given social information is he's going to compute how similar he is to each of these individuals, and then when it comes time to make a decision, he's going to look at what each of these people chose and weight that in proportion to the similarity, right? So it's dyadic because it's operating over pairs of similarities. Similarities defined between pairs of individuals. So one way to operationalize similarity in the context of decision making would be that basically he's counting how many times his preferences in the past overlapped with the preferences of each of these other individuals, and that's going to determine the corresponding weight of those individuals. So one implication of this is that if two individuals have exactly the same preference overlap, they're going to exert exactly the same social influence. And I'm going to actually show that this is wrong, that we can create situations in which two individuals have the same preference overlap but exert differential social influence. And the way that I'm going to do that is by showing that the introduction of a third individual can basically disrupt the whole thing and alter the balance between those individuals, because that third individual is going to change the social groups that are inferred on the basis of the preference data. All right. So to make this clear, let me introduce you to this experimental paradigm. So it's very simple. Subjects are going to choose between different movies that they want to see, and then they're going to observe the choices of other individuals other individuals making the same choices for the same movies. And then at the end of each block, what they're going to see is a mystery choice where they get information about two of these individuals' preferences, but no information about the actual movie itself, right? So it's a kind of a pure measure of social influence on choice. And as I said before, the dyadic similarity model predicts that agents with equal choice overlap should show no differential social influence. Now, the way that I'm going to convince you that this is wrong is by introducing a third individual. And let me illustrate this geometrically. So let's imagine this is the participant, and this is a kind of an abstract choice space where proximity in that space corresponds to greater preference overlap. And so here are A and B. These are the two individuals that show up in that mystery choice, and they're equidistant by design from the participant in both of these conditions. Now, what differs between these two conditions is the degree of agreement between a third individual, C, and the participant. Now, the third individual shows up during those initial rounds that I showed you before. It shows up in phase B, but it doesn't show up in the mystery choice. So to the extent that this third individual, C, is changing the clustering of these individuals, that would be evidence for latent groups determining social influence rather than something like dyadic similarity. And in particular, our hypothesis is that when C is placed here, so there's a lot of overlap between P and B, then these guys are all going to be clustered together into a single cluster, whereas over here, C and B will be clustered together, and that might actually enhance the probability of P and A being clustered together, right? So depending on where you put C, you could have a big influence on social influence. And we see that here in the data where the probability of choosing consistently with individual B changes across these conditions, across these agreement conditions, okay? So this is holding dyadic similarity fixed. So we can take this as evidence that there's differential social influence in the absence of differential preference overlap, and that's consistent with the latent groups model. So how do we actually bring to bear the Bayesian nonparametrics ideas into this? So the idea here is that this is what the subjects observe. They observe the choices of their own choices and the choices of the individuals, and they're trying to find a grouping of those individuals, including themselves, such that this grouping has high prior probability under the Chinese restaurant process and is highly consistent with the choices that they observe. So the basic principle here is that if you're grouped together with another person, you're going to have similar choices. And Bayes' rule is going to weigh both the consistency with the observed data and the prior overgroupings. And you can see that the model captures this pattern. And in fact, you can actually move C around and show that the model captures the quantitative changes in the social influence in this task. So we can predict fairly well how much influence B versus A is going to exert on the mystery choice, depending on the position of C, where we've held fixed, again, the dyadic similarity. We've also used this model to understand some developmental data. So there's a famous study by Berkeley and Gopnik where they were studying 14-month-olds and 18-month-olds. And the 14-month-olds and 18-month-olds were split into different conditions. These are called the mismatch and the match condition. So in both conditions, the experimenter is going to taste some food and make either an expression of disgust or an expression of happiness. And what they did was in the match condition, the expressions of disgust and happiness were matched to the child's preferences. So most children like goldfish and don't like broccoli so much. And so in the match condition, the experimenter showed a disgust face to broccoli and a happy face to goldfish, whereas in the mismatch condition, they just switched this, right? So now the experimenter's preferences are mismatched to the child's. And the critical question was, when we now give these two foods to the child and say, all right, the experimenter is hungry, which food would they like? What are they going to do, right? To what extent are they going to pay attention to the experimenter's preferences versus their own preferences? And what they found was that 14-month-olds tend to give goldfish to the experimenter in both conditions, right? So they basically thought the experimenter would like goldfish no matter what expression the experimenter made in response to eating goldfish. Whereas by 18 months, they figured out that the experimenter had different preferences from themselves, so in the mismatch condition, they should give broccoli to the experimenter, even though they themselves don't want broccoli. Okay? And one natural way to think about this in the context of these Bayesian nonparametric models is that we're not just inferring the underlying grouping structure, the clustering structure, but we're also inferring something about the complexity of the environment. So remember that your prior over complexity is determined by the single parameter, the concentration parameter alpha. And intuitively, that concentration parameter should grow over time to accommodate the increasing complexity of your experience, right? So when you're very little, you might have a fairly simple world. And when you're bigger, when you get older and you see that there's lots of different individuals with different preferences, you should increase alpha to allow for more complex groupings. So what we showed through simulation is that can capture the difference in results. So what's shown here on the left is that the probability of two groups is increasing with the concentration parameter. That should be intuitive. And as you increase the concentration parameter, you can basically go from 14-month-olds to 18-month-olds choice probabilities. Now, there was, many years later, Gopnik's lab did a follow-up study just a few years ago where they reasoned that maybe they could actually train 14-month-olds to look like 18-month-olds by exposing them to more diverse desires. So they created what they call diverse desire training, which is basically showing them a bunch of different experimenters who like different things. And it turned out that this diverse desire training was sufficient to basically reverse the results that I just showed you, such that 14-month-olds act like 18-month-olds. They recognize that the experimenter could have different preferences from themselves. And we can capture this in our model by allowing the model to learn not just about the clustering, the latent groups, but also about alpha, the complexity of the environment. So they learn that alpha is increasing as a function of the diversity of their experience. Yes?
Why is it intuitive that alpha should increase? Simply being exposed to more data should allow for more complex posterior without any change in the alpha.
Yes, that is true. So you can accommodate more complexity with more data. That's absolutely true, right? But what we're interested in here is why is it that basically the 14-month-olds and the 18-month-olds got exactly the same data in this case, right? So why are they behaving differently? Our reasoning was that what's different between them is this hyperparameter that's governing their inferences about the latent groupings in this particular experimental situation. Does that make sense?
So it's like learning about the hyperparameters.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I'm not saying that's the only way to explain these data, but that's how we thought about it. Any other questions? Okay. So this is just kind of the tip of the iceberg. There have been many interesting extensions of these ideas where you can take the Chinese restaurant process as this basic building block, but build more complex models. So for example, learning cross-cutting categories, that's known as the cross-cat model that Pat Shafto developed. That's essentially doing a bi-clustering of both objects and features. You can do the same idea, you can apply the same ideas to relational learning. This is known as the infinite relational model from Charles Kemp. You can do multi-level category learning using a nested version of the Chinese restaurant process. So you can kind of, you can define hierarchically organized groups where one group is kind of recursively embedded in a lower level group. And I'm actually, if I have time, I'll show you some applications of this idea to motion perception. All right, so if you guys are satisfied, I'll move on to latent feature models, but please feel free to hit me with any questions. Okay. All right, so latent feature models. So this is a really fundamental question in cognitive science and more broadly for computational models of intelligence. So what is a feature? You get data, and we all have a kind of intuitive sense of what a feature is, but how do we actually discover that from our data? So Joe Osterweil has this example of, he'd show these shapes to people, and the question is, how do we figure out what are the underlying features of this object? And the solution that he proposed in its simplest form, he had more elaborate versions of this idea, is to decompose this, this picture into a linear combination of a set of object features and this binary vector that tells you whether whether a particular feature is present in the image or not. Right? So this would say that the first feature is present and the fourth feature is present, but not the second and third features. And so you sum them up and you get this image, right? That's obviously not going to work for complex images because you have things like rotational invariance, and so he developed more complex versions of this idea, but this should give you the basic flavor of the notion here. And so when you have multiple images, then that could all possibly share the same features. So your learning problem can be represented in matrix form where you have n objects and d observable features, and then you have k unobservable features, and so you're factoring this observable feature matrix into the inner product between this latent feature activation matrix. So it's a binary matrix that says whether a particular feature is active for a particular object, and this matrix Y, which basically describes the appearance of each feature in the image. Okay? So how do we model the distribution over features when we don't know how many different features there are in the first place? We want to infer that from the data. So this leads us to the Indian buffet process. The Indian buffet process gets its culinary metaphor from its inventors, Tom Griffiths and Zubin Garmani, who were living in London at the time, and they were impressed by the seemingly infinite number of dishes in Indian buffet restaurants. And so they developed something that's fairly analogous to the Chinese restaurant process, except instead of tables, we have dishes. So the idea is that customers, again, correspond to data points. So the customer comes in, but now instead of sitting at a single table, they can select multiple dishes. So the idea is that they're going to, again, select dishes in proportion to their popularity, but they're also going to select a Poisson number of new dishes. We again have this concentration parameter alpha, which is controlling the complexity of the model, basically the number of new dishes you're going to sample. So we can compare the Chinese restaurant process and the Indian buffet process, where in both cases we have basically objects, data points or clusters or customers, or sorry, objects or customers, and in the Chinese restaurant process we have tables where a single customer can only be seated at a single table, whereas in the Indian buffet process we have dishes where each customer can sample multiple dishes. So let me apply this now to some work in classical conditioning. Anna's going to talk more about classical conditioning a bit later. So there's a really important thread of ideas in theories of classical conditioning which are designed to explain how animals take multiple stimuli and combine that to make a prediction of how much reward or punishment they should expect. Okay? So a classic example for, is if you train animals with two stimuli, so two stimuli get paired with reward, then when the animal gets them put together, they will expect twice as much reward. So that the idea is that the elemental associations are going to sum to produce the compound response. Okay? Now, that actually leads to some surprising predictions. My favorite is called the overexpectation effect. So in this example, like I just said, you're conditioning stimulus A and stimulus B together, or sorry, separately, and then you condition them together, and then you test one of the elements in compound. And kind of surprisingly, the response to the stimulus element B is lower compared to if you just trained it by itself. Now that's weird, right? Because how is it possible that this training regime actually decreased the animal's conditioned response when throughout the experiment they've only ever been positively reinforced in the presence of these stimuli? And the answer is that because of summation, in this case, oh, this is running out of battery. So in this case, stimulus A and B, when they're put together, you're going to expect twice as much reward, but you only got the same amount of reward, right? So that's actually a disappointment. That's going to produce a negative prediction error. And that's going to cause the animal to reduce its conditioned response. And that's why this compound conditioning is going to actually reduce the response, despite the fact that the animals have only ever been reinforced in the presence of these stimuli. Now, the story turns out to be more complicated than this, and the reason is that you don't always see summation in classical conditioning. And in particular, sometimes stimuli seem to act configurably. A famous example of this is negative patterning, or as it's known in AI research, the XOR problem. So this looks very similar. You condition these stimuli independently, and then you put them together, but this time you don't reinforce them. And then you test B by itself. And the critical observation is that this compound non-reinforcement does not significantly decrement the response to the stimulus by itself. Okay? So somehow the animal has learned that B can predict reward by itself, but when it's put in compound with A, that's like a different thing. It's a different configuration that will acquire its own associative strength, and these things will be separate. So it's a very clear violation of the elemental assumption of these models that things have to summate, right? So that leads to a puzzle, right? So why does summation occur sometimes and not other times? And one clue to this puzzle is the observation that the position of stimuli in perceptual space matters a lot. So let me give you an example of this. We can compare two different compound conditioning regimes, one in which the stimuli are from different modalities, so like a tone and a light, and one where they're from the same modality, like two tones. And it turns out that you will only see a summation effect when they're from different modalities. When they're from the same modality, they act configurably, and you fail to see a summation effect. And this turns out to be true also if you have stimuli that might be from the same modality, but they're separated spatially. So when you separate stimuli spatially, then they can start acting elementally again. So there seems to be something important about the spatial position of these elements to determine whether they're described configurably or elementally. Yes? Good question. I'm not sure. Off the top of my head, I wouldn't be surprised if they did, but I can't remember. Yeah.
Because it's like two sources.
Yeah. So you have the right intuition. So let me just lay out how we thought about this. This is the work of Fabian Soto. So the idea here is that that summation doesn't actually operate over stimuli at all. It operates over latent causes. And Anna's going to talk more about latent causes in classical conditioning. But in this context, different objects can be, that in a compound can be generated by different latent causes, or they can be generated by the same latent cause. And you're only going to see summation when they're generated by different latent causes. If they're generated by the same latent cause, they're going to act configurably. So what's pushing them to be in the same latent cause or different latent causes, that depends on their position in perceptual space. And the assumption here is that each latent cause is actually responsible for generating the observable features of the objects in perceptual space. And in particular, each latent cause is associated with what we're calling a consequential region in perceptual space. So in this case, it's just a rectangle that's axis aligned in this perceptual space. And so the generative model is that a latent cause is going to produce one of these consequential regions and then sample uniformly stimuli from within that consequential region. From the observer's perspective, from the animal's perspective in these experiments, they're trying to invert that model. So they get to see the perceptual features and the rewards, and they're trying to figure out what were the latent causes that generated them. And depending on what inferences they make, they'll behave either elementally or configurally. So an important principle that's governing, there's kind of an automatic consequence of Bayesian inference in this context is what's sometimes known as the size principle. So the idea is that if data are sampled uniformly from a concept's extension, so this is known as strong sampling, so a concept's extension in this case corresponds to the consequential region, so uniform sampling from that consequential region, then concepts with large extensions are going to receive less evidential support from data than concepts with small extensions. One way to think about this is that what the model is kind of doing is betting on particular data. So it's saying if I have a really big consequential region, I can produce more data, but any data that I observe is going to be less probable under that large consequential region because the nature of probability, I have to spread out the probability mass between the different hypotheses, and so it's going to basically diffuse the responsibility for any one data point. And this is something that's known as Bayesian Occam's razor because it's going to prefer simpler concepts over more complex concepts. And in this context, what we mean by simple is that the consequential regions are going to be smaller, right? So they can generate fewer patterns of data, but they place higher probability mass on any one of those patterns of data. So first, let me just show you that the model can capture this effect, this modality effect that you get summation from when they're from different modalities, but not when they're from the same modality. And the way to explain this computationally is that when you're in different modalities, the stimuli are spread out in space, and it's very unlikely that these two stimuli were generated from a single latent cause, which would require it to specify a consequential region that basically covered this entire rectangle. Whereas when they're from the same modality, so we can think about them as basically lying along a line in this space, then it's much higher probability that they were generated from a latent cause because you can basically put a really small volume rectangle over both stimuli. Does that make sense? Okay, yes?
Just to follow up again, so if you had different modalities, but they were correlated in some way, then you would expect the observed for a single latent cause.
Yeah.
You not expect.
Yeah, so the correlation structure, that's a good point. So we deliberately put some constraints here where these stimulus dimensions are supposed to be separable, right? So they're perceived as perceptually distinct, whereas there's a whole literature on the effect of integral dimensions where there's a kind of a latent dimension that you have to figure out. And we kind of skirted that whole issue. I think, I don't know if the model is really going to adequately capture what you're talking about, like learning the whole correlation structure of the stimuli, because it's assuming this axis-aligned dimensional structure. But I don't see any reason why it couldn't be, a variant couldn't be developed that did that. Yeah. Okay, so this is my kind of quick tour of feature learning. I'm going to move on to function learning unless people have more questions about features. Okay. Yes.
I've got a question.
Yeah.
Applying the same reasoning that, the more complex the model, the less evidence any one observation is for the model.
Yeah.
How much evidence do you think there's actually for your model? That you just said,
Yeah.
variant can be.
Well, I mean, I would refer you to this paper where we cover a pretty wide number of phenomena in the animal learning literature that can be explained by this model. There's a lot more in it than just this one demonstration about the modality effect. So we try to cover a pretty large range of summation experiments where they manipulated different things, not just modality. Whether or not that's sufficient evidence to believe the model is another question. But one thing that we did try to do is compare to standard models and show that actually the standard accounts cannot capture as many phenomena as in that particular literature.
But all the models that, or the same model that assumed separability of the two dimensions explained all these pieces of data.
Yes, that's right, yeah. But again, I totally concede that there's a whole domain of stimuli where that's not going to be true, and we would want to look at other variants of that model. Well, one kind of high-level point about all of these models is that I don't want to convey the sense that like I'm so wedded to any particular model. What I'm trying to introduce you to here is a kind of modeling framework. So there's a bunch of high-level principles that underlie all of the models that I'm going to talk about: Bayesian inference, non-parametric hypothesis spaces, things like the size principle, and those are going to cut across many different particular models. But to make any of these models really work in a serious way to explain a lot of data, we have to make a whole bunch of assumptions. So that's true, I'm kind of glossing over a lot of those assumptions. And then I think the best work in this area are ones that start with a really basic model and then kind of ratchet up the complexity to capture other kinds of phenomena. So for example, for the latent feature learning model, Joe Osterweil and Tom Griffiths have very nice work showing how you can make modified assumptions that capture all sorts of variations of these experiments that are more plausible, like rotation invariance, for example. We can talk about it more later. Okay. So let me talk about function learning. So I showed you this picture before, and the question was, what sort of functional form should I apply to the data? There is an elegant mathematical framework for thinking about this, which looks a little bit different from the frameworks that I showed you before, although it's still considered a Bayesian non-parametric framework. You had a question? Yeah.
Can I ask one more thing about feature?
Yeah.
So the Osterweil and Griffiths example showed look a lot like sort of things you might see in neural network learning in regards to, here are visual features that the network learners are.
Yeah.
Do you think there's a sense in trying to view that sort of like very automated feature learning under this Indian buffet non-parametric?
Yeah, that's a great question. It's not really non-parametric in the technical sense because the number of parameters are not growing with the data. That being said, I think it's a totally reasonable approach to feature learning, right? So it's a kind of somewhat philosophically different approach, right? So instead of trying to infer this do inference over these discrete random variables that represent whether a feature exists or not, what it's essentially doing is a kind of distributed representation of features, and that has its pros and cons, right? So there's a very clear algorithmic advantage of doing that, which a lot of people have exploited, which is that it's completely differentiable and you can apply backprop and all that stuff. And I'm sure that's what they're talking about next door right now. On the other hand, the argument could be made that it has the downside of being less interpretable to us, those features. Now, that may or may not be important, right? I don't necessarily need, the neurons in my brain don't need to be interpretable to me. I sort of need my thoughts to be interpretable, or at least some interface to be interpretable. But there could be a whole lot of other stuff going on under the hood that's not really interpretable, nor should it be interpretable. And I'm happy to have that discussion more, but maybe we should keep going with the introduction. We can talk about that offline. All right, so sadly there's no culinary metaphor for this one. It's just called the Gaussian process. If this is the first time encountering it, it's a little bit hard to wrap your head around because what I'm going to describe to you is a distribution over functions. So I'm going to place a whole distribution over a functional space. I'm going to sample a function from a Gaussian process that's parameterized by a mean function and a covariance function, or what's sometimes known as a kernel. And then I'm going to sample data by basically taking noisy samples from that function at different inputs. So x represents the input to the function and y is the output. And the idea here is analogous to Gaussian distributions that you might be more familiar with. So just like the mean of a Gaussian represents its central tendency. Here, the mean function represents the central tendency of the function, right? So if you sample from a Gaussian process, you'll get functions that look like the mean function. But more interestingly, the covariance function, or the kernel, is capturing something about the smoothness of that function. So in the same way that a sample from a Gaussian distribution, a multivariate Gaussian distribution is going to, its covariance structure is going to determine basically how correlated different dimensions are. Here, the covariance function is going to determine how correlated the function values are across different points in the input space, okay? So if we think about the input space, for example, as time, then what the kernel is specifying is how smooth the function is over time, okay? And it turns out, I'm not going to go into the math, but it turns out that if you observe some data, you observe XY pairs, then you can compute the posterior distribution over the functions in closed form. Now, what does that even mean, right? So this is a function. How do we have a posterior distribution over functions? Well, actually, what you need in practice is not the whole posterior distribution over the functions, but rather you're going to just query specific data points. So as long as you're just querying specific data points, the whole thing is finite dimensional, and that has some tractable algebraic forms. If you want to learn more about this, I highly recommend an excellent textbook by Rasmussen and Williams called Gaussian Processes. So let me just show you a few examples of a function sampled from different Gaussian processes. So these processes, I don't know why the screen all of a sudden looks weird. So what you can see here is that the functions differ basically in their wiggliness. So some functions change very fast at a fast time scale, and other functions change more slowly. That's determined by the structure of the covariance function. And I'm going to show you a few covariance functions in a few slides. So now once you observe data, for example, here are some data points, you can use those covariance functions to and the Gaussian process computations to compute the posterior distribution over the function at different data points, and you get not only the expectation of that function, but also these confidence intervals, these credible intervals. So they're Bayesian posterior. There's a summary statistics of the posterior distribution. Now, what we're interested in here is not just the mathematics of this, but also the application to human function learning. There's been quite a few studies of human function learning, and there's a nice paper by Chris Lucas and colleagues showing that Gaussian processes could actually explain the kind of canonical patterns in this function learning literature where there's particular biases in learning different kinds of functions. Like, people are quite good at learning linear functions, but if you give them an exponential or a quadratic, they sort of systematically miss parts of the function, and that has to do with the regularization that accompanies any Bayesian treatment of function learning, that it's going to, the inferred functions are going to basically be pulled towards the prior. Now what I'm really interested in is the more complex aspects of human function learning. So let me explain what I mean by complex aspects of function learning. If you look at this function, what do you see? Who can describe to me what's going on in this function? Yeah?
Seasonal variation and flight, people taking flights.
Okay, so what you're pointing out are these seasonal oscillations, right? But what else is going on? Yeah, okay, so it's going up over time, and what else is going on? Yeah, the variance is increasing, and the amplitude of the oscillations is increasing. So there's a bunch of different things in here, and they're all kind of interacting together to produce this function. And actually, when I have more time, what I usually do is send someone out of the room, and then they have to come back and redraw this function. Actually, my lab is doing experiments on this, having people draw these functions from descriptions. What I think is really cool is that you can look at this function, which has many, many data points, hundreds of data points, I think, but you can describe it in a few sentences, and someone can come in and just hear those sentences and essentially redraw the structure of this function. So how do they do that? Right? It's clear that they're exploiting some kind of compositionality, right? They know that there's some underlying latent structure there that's getting combined through some compositional operations. And that's really what I'm interested in. And so we tried to tackle this using actually, so the original people to tackle this are James Lloyd and David Duveneau, who were working with Zubin Garamani, and they developed Gaussian process methods that had an underlying compositional kernel. It turns out that Gaussian processes are really nicely adapted to this because you can do algebraic operations to the kernels that, that preserve Gaussian processes. In other words, if you, for example, add two kernels or multiply them together, you get a new kernel which is itself specifies a valid Gaussian process. And so we exploited that fact. Where what we're going to do is define a set of functional atoms, the base kernels, and some composition operators that are going to take these base kernels and combine them to make new kernels. And we're going to treat the structured learning problem as going from the observed functional data and trying to recover the underlying structure. Right? What were the atoms that actually were used to produce this data set, and what were the compositions? So here were the kernels we used, and this is not an exhaustive list, but this worked for us. So we can have a squared exponential kernel, which basically captures smooth, kind of wiggly structure in the functions. We can have a periodic kernel, which is going to capture periodic structure, linear functions, which are going to capture things like the linear trends that we just saw, constant functions, and then white noise. So this is showing you examples of the kinds of functions that these different kernels are going to produce. And then we define some compositional operators, in particular multiplication and addition, which you can use to synthesize new, more complex functions. So we can basically construct this sort of grammar of functions that could capture a lot of different variation in naturalistic real-world functions. And this is the work by Lloyd and Duvino and colleagues, showing that this can capture things like the airline passenger data. And in fact, they even built an automated statistician that could take in the data and give you basically a human interpretable report of that data. I'll just, since I'm running out of time, I think we need to stop at 1:30 for the break. Or no, wait a second. So, yeah, or 2:30. Oh, 3. Okay, sorry. So actually, this doesn't even say what time it is. Almost 2. Okay, good. So I'm not so constrained. Thank God. All right. So as a comparison, before I get to the human experiments, I want to give you a kind of a baseline alternative model. This is proposed recently by Wilson and Adams, and it's called the spectral mixture kernel. And don't get too hung up on the math here. The basic idea is that you can approximate any kernel as a mixture distribution in the spectral density space. So if I take the eigendecomposition of the function, so I have these eigenfunctions, and I can that's going to give me the spectral density is basically telling me contribution of the eigenfunctions of different frequencies, and that maybe is gibberish to a lot of you. But the important point is that I can actually capture a pretty complex functional structure by plopping down mixtures of Gaussians in this spectral density. So for example, it can capture the structure of the airline passenger data that I just showed you, or at least roughly. Now, importantly, there's no kind of human interpretable structure, right? When you look at the airline passenger data, you're not going to tell me something about eigenfunctions and particular frequencies. Although I gave a talk about this to applied math colloquium once, and they had a different response. But so what I'm going to show you are experiments where we basically pitted these functions, these different kernels against each other, and we asked, can the compositional kernel explain people's function learning behavior better than the alternatives that are equally expressive, like the spectral mixture kernel or the radial basis function kernels? That's another name for the squared exponential kernel. So these are kernels that can capture kind of arbitrary smooth structure in the data but are non-compositional. So for example, we would give people these pattern completion experiments, extrapolation tasks, where we'd show them this blue pattern. We'd give them a choice of different extrapolations, which were generated by different kernels. And when you do this, so in the very first experiment, we sampled the functions from a compositional kernel, the true underlying function from a compositional kernel, and not surprisingly, people did prefer the compositional kernel for the completion. But more interestingly is where you sample the functions from the spectral mixture kernel, right? And they still prefer the compositional kernel completions, right? So they seem to have an inductive bias for compositionality in their extrapolation judgments. We've and so we kind of built on this and tried to do a bunch of other experiments. For example, trying to obtain the full distribution, posterior distribution over functions that we think people are representing in their heads. And we use this interesting technique called Markov chain Monte Carlo with people, which, without getting into the details, you basically get people to simulate a Markov chain whose stationary distribution is the posterior. And so you basically are giving them choices between functions, and if you give them enough of these choices in sequence, you'll get the samples of those functions correspond to samples from their internal representation of the function space, their inductive biases. And what we find is that when we do this, it's probably hard for some of you to see, but basically this is the posterior distribution over functions, and they typically place the most probability mass on the correct compositional function for that they were shown. So that's the bars highlighted in red are the true underlying compositional function. And the same is true actually for real-world functions. So people tend to favor completions of real-world functions that actually match the underlying real-world data. So like airline passenger data or gym memberships, for example. We've done this also with manual pattern completion, where we actually have people draw the functions and use the root mean squared error between their drawing and the true function to measure how, their drawing and the inferred function under the model. And what we find is that in general, particularly focusing on extrapolation, people's drawings of the function seem to match better the compositional function than the other functions. It turns out, interestingly, that the RBF kernel kind of produces the same answers as the compositional kernel for interpolation judgments. Now, there's much more to say about this. I'll just quickly tell you a few other things just to drive the point home. So one is that people find compositional functions more predictable than compositional functions. And it turns out that there's a whole bunch of other phenomena, related phenomena that where people seem to have some kind of advantage for compositional functions over spectral mixture functions. So for example, people find compositional functions easier to detect changes in, and they're easier to store in memory. So you have a higher memory capacity when you're trying to remember compositional functions compared to non-compositional functions. Another interesting observation is that when people make numerosity judgments, if there are statistical regularities in the display of items that they have to remember, then they will show a systematic bias towards a lower numerosity judgment. In other words, they tend to underestimate the number of items in the display, and that underestimation grows with the regularity. And this is true actually for compositional functions. So if you give people compositional functions, they will underestimate the number of items in the display, where we've broken down here. I'll just show you an example of this, where we've broken down the function into little dots, and they have to count the number of red dots. They tend to underestimate the number of items more for compositional functions than for spectral functions, even though these both have some statistical regularities, but somehow the compositional functions have sort of regularities that seem to match people's internal models better. In the interest of time, I maybe skip over this a little bit and tell you about an example of where we can put some of these building blocks together to capture more complex phenomena. So in particular, I'm going to show you how we can take these function learning models and combine them with mixture models to understand something about motion perception. So the starting question here is, how do we parse a moving scene? If you look at moving scenes, they're composed of very complex motions, but there's some internal structure there, right? So intuitively, like, for example, if you look at this soccer game, there's lots of motion energy in this scene, but at a coarse grain, one team is moving in one direction, the other team is moving in the opposite direction. And then if you zoom in more, then you see individuals players that are moving kind of within the reference frame of their team. And if you zoom in even more, you see people's body parts moving in relation to the reference frame formed by their body. And the argument here is that this is true of many different kinds of scenes, going from dance to watching movies to different kinds of athletic games, where we can parse complex moving scenes into an underlying hierarchical structure that kind of reigns in the complexity of the moving scene. So just to give you an example here with Spider-Man, let's see if this works. So when you watch the scene, notice that although a lot of stuff is happening here, you can very clearly discern the motion of Dr. Octopus and Spider-Man relative to the train, and the train relative to the background. And if you look at just at Dr. Octopus, you can see the motion of his tentacles relative to his body. Right? So there's a lot of internal kind of hierarchically organized structure in this scene. And this is schematizing it here. And the question here is, how does our brain actually accomplish this parsing? Right? That's the non-trivial question. And it turned out that the basic answer to this question was worked out in a seminal contribution by Gunnar Johansson in his PhD thesis, which was published as a book in 1950. And many people know Johansson from his famous point light walkers, which have been used to study biological motion. But all this happened like 23 years before the point light walkers, and he has dozens of studies in this that use much simpler displays. So for example, in this display, probably most of you see the middle dot oscillating vertically in a horizontally oscillating reference frame. But if you only saw the dot by itself, unfortunately the video was not working. If you just saw this middle dot by itself, what you would see is diagonal motion. So by placing these collinear flankers around that dot, you can completely change the percept to one that is hierarchically organized. Here's another famous example. So when you see this dot, what you probably see is what's called cycloidal motion. It's kind of bouncing like this. But if I add another dot that's just horizontally translating, then we see rotational motion. So this is known as the Duncker wheel. It's another example of hierarchically organized motion. So you have the outer dot that's rotating around the inner dot. Now, Johansson had basically the right idea, I think, which is that he proposed something called vector analysis. The idea is that you see these dot displays, and you're going to parse it into a set of vectors that summate to predict the total motion of the scene. And so those underlying vectors correspond to the underlying hierarchical structure. So, for example, this display is going to be parsed into the sum of this horizontal motion that belongs to all three dots, and then this vertical motion which belongs to just the middle dot. The problem with vector analysis is that many different vector analyses are consistent with any given moving scene. So how do you choose one of the vector analyses? And to solve this problem, various authors propose certain kinds of principles or heuristics, like a minimum principle that simpler motions are preferred, or an adjacency principle that you assign dots to nearest reference frame. But there wasn't really any unifying theory, and so that's what we tried to accomplish. And we started with a very influential idea about Bayesian motion perception that was developed by Yair Weiss and Ted Adelson in the 90s, what they called the slow and smooth model. And the basic idea is that motion is ambiguous, but we have priors which prefer spatially smooth motion and temporally slow motion. Right? So motions tend to be slow and they tend to be smooth. But this doesn't tell us anything about the hierarchical organization of motion. So what we proposed was an extension of this to what we call Bayesian vector analysis. And the basic structure here is what we call a motion tree. And the idea is that what you observe are motions of these different points on the image, and those points on the image are the motion at each of those points corresponds to the sum along a path through this tree. So in each of these nodes in the tree, there's some vector field of motion which reflects the relative motion of that object in the tree relative to its parent. So for example, if you look at Spider-Man's hand, his hand's motion is the sum of the relative motion with respect to his body and his body's relative motion with respect to the background. Okay, and so we can construct this kind of parse for every different point in the image. And then the inference problem is, given the sequence of images, I want to do inference over the tree structure. And one thing that we did for computational convenience is that each of the vector fields that live in each of these nodes was modeled as a Gaussian process. So the Gaussian process captures this idea that motion should be smooth over the image. But because we're adding up a bunch of Gaussian processes, and I told you that Gaussian processes are closed under addition, one convenient thing we can do is basically marginalize over all the different vector fields here and just get a marginal likelihood of the tree conditional on the image sequence. So that's very convenient computationally, because it means that we just have to do inference over the tree, not over all the different vector fields individually. And so this is what the Bayesian vector analysis gives you for the stimulus that I showed you before, where the vertical motion looks like this, but you perceive this hierarchically organized motion, and what the model gives you is a very simple motion tree in which this vertical motion is nested within the horizontal motion. And it can also capture things like the Dunker wheel, right? And actually quite a few other phenomena, like to some extent biological motion, motion contrast effects, and transparent motion. Are there questions about motion perception? Yes?
Have you done any work with eye tracking of these kinds of scenes?
No, we haven't done eye tracking.
Would that be like useful?
Maybe, yeah, sure. I'm happy to talk about it. Yeah, we've done other experiments to test this model. We've done experiments where we just ask people, we show people different displays and ask them whether a particular motion is nested within another motion. And there we can get really quantitatively accurate predictions about people's judgments. And more recently, we've been trying to do hierarchically organized multiple object tracking experiments. But yeah, we haven't tried anything with eye tracking. That's a good idea. Okay. So I'll just say, before finishing, I'll just say a few words about the problem of structured learning more generally, and basically, how can we automate structured learning so that we don't have to make these bespoke models for each individual case? And I'll give you a few vignettes of basically examples of ways people have tried to tackle this problem without necessarily preferring one over the other. So for example, I already showed you how inference over graph topology could be used to derive a pretty diverse range of stimulus spaces. So for example, Kemp and Tenenbaum used graph grammars that could build different kinds of structures like partitions, chains, orders, rings, hierarchies, trees, grids, and cylinders, and then they showed that applied to different data, you could get different kinds of structures, right? So the model didn't know going in that, for example, Supreme Court justice voting patterns are organized into a one-dimensional linear space, but the model figured that out, right? Whereas faces would be organized into a two-dimensional plane. So that's for graph grammar. That works nicely for graph grammars. Another setting in which this has been pursued is trying to unify different kinds of unsupervised dimensionality reduction techniques. So this work by Roger Gross and colleagues tried to apply kind of a similar spirit of ideas where we're going to define a kind of grammar over dimensionality reduction methods where the grammar applies to the underlying generative model. In other words, we can take some building blocks and put them together to produce more complex patterns of data. For example, we can derive things like low-rank approximations, clustering, linear dynamics, sparsity binary factor analysis, basically by just taking some basic operations and composing them together. So in Roger Gross's work, you can kind of traverse this tree to recover well-known models that have been studied in the literature. And what they did was they actually presented an algorithm which you'd give it the data set, and it would navigate this tree to find the appropriate structure, just like in the structure learning work that I told you in the context of function learning, where it's trying to learn which kind of function, which kind of base kernels to compose together to capture the appropriate function. Here it's which kind of matrices to compose to capture the pattern of data. All right, so to summarize, non-parametric Bayesian models can be used to flexibly capture many different kinds of structure, and it can try to find the structure that is just right, so not too simple and not too complex. And I've discussed a growing experimental literature that captures the behavioral, many aspects of behavioral data in different domains like social structure learning, motion perception, function learning. And I didn't really talk about the neuroscience literature, but Anna's going to go into that a little bit to the extent that any coherent order can be brought to it. But I think that's one of the major outstanding questions, how any of this is actually implemented in the brain. And I want to emphasize here that what I'm giving you here is a kind of a set of building blocks which can be composed together to create more complex models. So any one of those models is probably too simple to capture real-world cognition, but maybe the overarching framework can be useful. If you want to learn more about the models that I talked about, there's some resources. This book chapter is a pretty good starting point. I think maybe they sent it to you, a link to you guys. I'm not sure. And then this is a more technical tutorial on Bayesian non-parametric models. All right, so thank you all for listening. And we'll start with Anne after the break, I think. And I'm happy to take any questions. Yeah.
So, the same principle used to add more clusters as the data comes in. Can it be used to add more levels of the hierarchy?
Yeah, yeah.
And is there evidence that humans do that?
Levels of the hierarchy. Well, there's evidence that people learn hierarchies, right? So the motion perception examples were, or I think examples of that. But whether they add more as more structure comes in, that part I haven't seen any demonstration of that. That would be an interesting question. Yeah.
So I was interested in your extrapolation from different types of generated functions.
Yeah.
Some of your kernels, like the principle can't be extrapolated, right? Like where an exponential function can only be extrapolated up to its support. At some point, like you can't predict the actual function's going to look like.
Yeah.
It predicts like the autocorrelation.
Uh-huh.
So did you look at that? Did you calculate like a Bayes error for what you would expect the output would be? Whether they met those functions, whether they were the same Bayes error for different classes of functions?
Wait, are you talking about whether human Bayes error? Well, I guess I'm not sure I understand.
But it's
Yeah.
like, so
Yeah.
given that you say knew what the underlying kernels were,
Mm-hmm.
like what the Bayes error prediction would be, given the magnitude of the kernels that this like compositional function shows, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because different ones, different functions have different extrapolatability.
Mm-hmm.
And then we show that different models have different extrapolation performance. It's hard to disattend.
Yeah. So I don't. I mean, of course, what you're saying is true. We're not really asking people to make long-range extrapolations, right? Because of course, yeah, like if it was really sampled from a radial basis function or something like that, then it's going to just go back to its prior pretty quickly. But that's also in part why we didn't give people those kinds of functions to extrapolate. Right? We were particularly interested in structured functions, whether that structure would be meaningful to people. Like it would make non-trivial difference to their extrapolation judgments. Yeah, I don't think we didn't try to systematically analyze, their errors of that. Like we're not making absolute claims about their errors. We're making relative claims about to what extent can one kernel predict their behavior better than another. We do have this other line of work that I didn't talk about where we were interested in people's predictability judgments, and there we were using some learning theory bounds on a particular kernel's performance to try to predict quantitatively people's predictability judgments. But that's not exactly the same thing that you're talking about. All right. Thanks.
Okay, so let's get started. I think we've had a really long break, a nice break, so we should be ready to start again. I'm Anne Collins. I'm a professor at UC Berkeley in the Department of Psychology. This is a bit low. Okay, can you hear me? Great, thank you. Okay, so I'm going to take a slightly different angle from Sam and focus on the growth of skills rather than knowledge. But you also see that many of the similar high-level principles apply to this aspect of structural learning. Hopefully that's what I'm trying to convince you of, although we're also going to focus a bit more on the algorithmic level in this part of the presentation. Okay, so what Sam defined as the central problem of structural learning was what's out there. What I'm going to focus on and argue is also a central problem of structural learning is, as much as what's out there, how should I actually interact with what's out there? So how should I interact with the world, not just how should I parse out what I observe from the world? Okay. So Sam gave some examples of what structural learning was from the what's out there point of view. For example, trying to describe data by answering questions of how many clusters there are, how many features, what the structural form or functional form are. And what I'm going to try to answer is what structure learning is when we're interacting with the world. So for example, if you take those four computers here, and if you only care about what's out there, and search for similarity in order to cluster things together, you might say that those three computers look fairly similar. They're all desktop computers, and so you might want to cluster them together. But if you know something about how to interact with all three of those computers, all four of those computers, then instead you're probably going to cluster them this way, because they all use the same operating system, contrary to the one on the left. Does it make sense? Same as Sam, I could speak for a long time, and I'm happy, and I don't have to get through everything, so I'm very happy for interruptions at any time. Okay, so the kind of questions that we'll be asking in this part of the tutorial are questions like how many rules, rather than clusters, how many rules do I need to know how to use any computer that's out there, for example. What is relevant in the world for me to figure out how to best act? What learning patterns can I make use of to be more efficient in my decisions? Okay, so when interacting with the world, people in applied math and computer science have proposed a number of frameworks. One of the ones that are very useful to think of is the concept of a Markov decision process. So we think of the fact that there's a set of states that's often labeled S, and that we often confound in psychology experiments for stimuli, because often the stimuli are state spaces. In response to those stimuli, an agent will take an action out of a set of actions. This action will let the agent transition to a new state. And this may lead to something valuable to the agent, so to some subjective reward. So Markov decision processes are one of the processes that tell us how we can interact with this representation, this formal representation of an interaction with the world. To formally represent this, our interaction with the world would define a policy as the probability of selecting an action in response to a state. And what we usually try to learn is what this policy should be in a given environment. Okay, so to formalize this in a very simple box and arrow diagram, it looks something like this. We have states. We have some kind of learning and decision algorithm that's missing an H. that helps us select an action that leads us to a next state. But this action also triggers a reaction from the environment, a reward, that is used in the learning algorithm to decide the policy, to update the policy. So the way I'm going to frame this tutorial is around this diagram, asking how we should represent all that's important here, how we should structure this representation. So for example, how should an agent represent the state space in such a way that they learn efficiently? What is the relevant action space? So really those questions are, what are the actual inputs and outputs, the state and action space to the learning algorithm? From once that's decided, you can also ask what the policy should be, how you should structure the representation of your policy, for example. So we can give a few examples of that. So for example, if you think of most Markov decision processes in the computer science field, they're often described as toy grid world models like this, where you have an agent represented by the square that has maybe 4 different actions. So in this case, the state space would be discrete positions in space. So it's really what we think of as a space in this case, and actions, actual motor actions of moving in different directions. That's often used in AI and a bit less in psychology. In psychology, we do have a fairly equivalent aspect to that, where we can decide with a given degree of granularity what the physical space or the state space is. So for example, here you could decide that there are 3 important locations in this maze, and the actions also, instead of getting the whole continuous of motor actions, you could decide just go left or right in this case. In banded tasks or the learning tasks, a state space might be a stimulus, for example, here a star, and the action space might be comprised of those 3 motor actions. Okay, so in those cases, there's a fairly clear definition of what the state and action spaces are. But it can get more tricky than that. So for example, you might have a learning task in which you're charged to pick with one of 2 items on the screen, and you might pick this one here and that one here. And here it gets trickier, right? So for example, should you describe the action as picking the star or picking the circle, or should it be pick blue or pick red, or should it be pick left or pick right? Okay? And there's no a priori, there could even be many other kinds of actions that you might have a priori. Okay? So the question of structural learning here is going to be, well, how do you define what the relevant actions are, how the relevant action state is in this case. Okay. The last question that we'll ask is, even if you know what the inputs to the learning algorithm is, you can ask what the best way of learning is in a given situation, and that might vary. That's something you might learn across time in your environment. So this is what we'll call learning to learn. So for example, this learning algorithm could be a very simple reinforcement learning algorithm, the more free version of which is simply updating estimated values of a state with a temporal difference reward prediction error here. But in some environments, it might make more sense to use model-based reinforcement learning, where you do forward planning by modeling the transitions a few steps ahead and figuring out on the spot what the best choice is. And there might be many different kind of learning algorithms that might be useful in different situations. And part of structural learning is figuring out what the algorithm would be that will help me interact with the world best. Okay, so the big picture of this part of the tutorial, relating it to Sam's tutorial, is that we're also still working to discover hypothesis spaces, essentially. We're also still working to figure out, have hypotheses over what the state space should be, or the action space, or the learning algorithm should be. But the space is not over what we observe in the world, it's over what we observe of our interactions with the world. Okay? And so the similarity measures that are going to matter is how similarly should I behave in different situations rather than how similar different situations themselves are. Which means that many similar principles are going to apply, and so I'm not going to introduce many of the things that Sam did, but that they have different constraints due to the specific nature of interactions with the world that are, for example, giving you fairly sparse information about the nature of the environment. Okay, so I'll have a few parts. I'll first try to show you a bit about what the field has learned about those different aspects of structural learning. So structuring the inputs of learning, the state spaces, structuring the outputs, the action spaces, structuring the policies, and here we'll talk about hierarchy. Sam already talked a bit about that, but they turn out to be very important also in structural learning about interactions. And structuring learning itself, so learning how to learn. And after that, so here I'll be focused on the cognitive and computational aspect of things, and I'll open this up a bit to the neuroscience questions of how the brain actually does all this, or at least what we know of this so far. And as a giveaway, it's that we both know a lot, and we also just really don't have a good big picture of what's happening, so you should work on this. Okay, any questions before I launch into the first part? Okay, so there's been a number of people who have tried to point out that most learning algorithms assume this state space as already defined, but that's a really big assumption to make in many ways. For example, if you take an everyday life kind of scene like this, it's extremely multidimensional, extremely crowded, and there's lots of information here. But if you're, for example, driving in a car right now, the most relevant information would really be just this red light, okay, that tells you that you should stop right now. And it's relevant because of how you're trying to interact with the world right now, driving a car. Okay? And defining this is difficult, and can be very difficult also for artificial agents, right? Because this is a very multidimensional state right now, a perceptual state. If you try to encode it, you could just encode all the pixels, or you could have a more compressed representation, but it would still be very highly dimensional. Whereas if you were to describe it with words, you could just say, is the light red or green? And you would have two states, and you would be happy with deciding to go or not, in this case, at first approximation. Okay. So what this is an illustration of is the fact that real life suffers from the curse of dimensionality, and that most reinforcement or learning methods are exponentially slowed by much more complex inputs, which makes it really hard to understand how learning fast, as humans do, can happen. So the idea here is that structural learning is is a process that we use to represent the state space into something that's more relevant, and potentially in this case to just compress the perceptual state space into something much smaller, much lower dimensional, over which we can have efficient learning. Okay, so the hypothesis is that individuals structure the state space to represent only the information that's relevant for their current interaction with the world. So Yael Niv and her lab explored this question a lot with this task. So let me walk you through it quickly. So in this task, participants see 3 stimuli on the screen, and those stimuli have one of 3 potential features on each of three potential dimensions. So here there's the color, the shape, and the feel of each stimulus can vary, and it can take one of three colors, so one of three values. So green, red, or yellow. Those three fields and those three shapes. Okay, and the participant's job is to pick just one of the three, and once they pick one, for example, the green square with the grid filling here, they may or may not win 1 point, and then they get on to an extra. Okay. And their job is to win as many points as possible. And the way the experiment is set up is that there's a single feature of a single dimension that leads to reward with probability 0.75. The other dimensions don't matter, and the other features of that dimension lead to no reward with probability 0.75. Okay, so what the participant will and participants will do short blocks of 10, 20 trials and multiple blocks of those, restarting from scratch each time. Okay, so you might start. You might experience this kind of reward history where you start with this red triangle, get 0, etc., etc., until at the end the participant here seems to have settled on picking the yellow feature as the more important one. As you see, it's probabilistic, so sometimes the yellow still gives them 0. Okay, so here, this is a case of learning the state space, because what the participants need to learn is that, in this case, for example, the shape does not matter, the fill does not matter, only the color matters. Okay, so that to represent the learning in this case, to make the learning faster, you should learn to only pay attention to a single dimension, so going back from all the possible combinations to only three potential values for the three colors, and then learn over that. So the participants are able to learn this. It's difficult, but they learn this fairly robustly. Here, this is a learning curve as a function of number of trials in the game, so they try to capture this learning with different hypotheses about how the learning of this state space might occur. The starting point is a Bayesian model, which would simply try to track optimally which of the 9 features, so the 3 colors, the 3 shape, the 3 textures, is predictive of reward, knowing that the feature predictive is giving a given probability of reward, and knowing that there's only one of those. Okay, so essentially giving the Bayesian model all the information about the task that the participants have, and then letting it infer what the best feature is based on its past history. They also proposed approximations of this process. So the most naive approximation is simply approximation of the learning process. So the most naive one is to perform naive reinforcement learning over the full state of stimuli. So in this case, that would be there are 27 possible different stimuli in this case, 3 by 3. 3 colors by 3 shape by 3 fields. Okay, so you could just represent the value of each item individually, not make use at all of the fact that there are potentially shared information, and see how this performs. A less naive version of this is what they call feature RL, where the participants learn weights for each feature. So that's represented here. Instead of learning 27, you learn 9 items this time, so the weight for each of the 3 colors, the weight for each of the 3 shapes, and the weight for each of the 3 textures, and update them in parallel each time, and then just estimate the value of a given stimulus by taking the mean of the value of the weight of its 3 features. Okay, so this is not taking into account at all the fact that there is one feature that matters, one dimension that matters, and another that doesn't matter. The other features are, the other dimensions are, all three dimensions are weighted equally. Another approximation would be to take this same model as before, the feature reinforcement learning, but weight the role of the different dimensions with attentional weights that are tracked with Bayesian inference from this model. Okay, so saying, well, over time I learned that color matters in this case, and so I'm going to use those weights that I learned here, but weighing only color more than shape or texture. So what they showed here is that a version of the feature RL model was the one that could account for behavior best. So there's two things to take out of this. One, that it does better than naive reinforcement learning, which means that it does take into account some of the structure of the state space, paying attention to the fact that it's organized into dimensions and features, but it also does way better than the optimal inference process that knows all about the structure of the task. Okay, so in this case, structural learning is about creating a state space that will simplify the problem to allow mitigating of the curse of dimensionality, and participants are able to do that, to simplify the state space, the state representation, and learn more efficiently. So represent the structure of the state space better. And that this seems to be captured much better by an approximate reinforcement learning process rather than an optimal Bayesian inference process. Any questions so far? Okay, so in this case, I was talking about the state space, and I was talking about all observable features of the state space, the three dimensions of the three visual dimensions. There are cases in which the information that is relevant to represent the state that matters may not be directly observable. In this case, you might need to create a latent space that you could call a latent hypothesis or a latent cause, or that people have called different things in the literature. Okay, so Sam did a lot of work on this, showing that people seem to create this kind of state spaces over latent spaces, and that's this classical conditioning example. So I think everybody's familiar with classical conditioning, which is the fact that an animal might be trained to hear a conditioned stimulus and then receive a shock. And after a few training trials, the animal will freeze in preparation for the shock, showing that they've learned to predict the outcome that's the unconditioned stimulus that's associated to this conditioned stimulus. And so the question is whether it's this tone that they associate with the cause, or whether there's whether it's this tone that's the state that's relevant for learning here, or whether it's something else, what they learn. Those slides are stolen from Sam, unashamedly. Okay, so there's a number of possibilities, right, for representing this. One might be that the tone directly, so you can represent this as a graphical model here. That one might be that the tone causes the shock. Another might be that the shock causes the tone. Another might be that something else, like Pavlov, caused both, and that it's independent. Okay, this is where we're going to go back to Sam's introduction on Chinese restaurant processes before, and non-parametric Bayesian is that some representations, this would be the parametric one, might be too constrained, and some might be too flexible. And this is where the non-parametric Bayesian that goes somewhere in between might be helpful to understand how the state spaces are represented. So for example, if there's many different investigators, you might not want to create a different cause for all of them. Okay? So the hypothesis that Sam and his colleagues put together was that animals assume a generative model in which the number of latent causes is unbounded, and a small number of latent causes is more likely a priori. So this is exactly the same principle as the clustering principles that he talked about earlier. Okay, so that if the animal experiences shocks with the tone in this red context a lot, and the tone without shock in this green context a lot, the animal might come to cluster them together and learn that the state representation that's valid in this case is linked to those clusters. And so to study this, they looked at the phenomenon of renewal, whereby an animal is trained to acquire a few response and acquisition in this in the first box. Then this few response is extinguished in a different environment, in a different cage. And then later on, we test whether how the animal responds to the sound in one of in a cage, either the original one, the second one, or a new cage. So what we find is that even though during extinction the animal learned to stop freezing because it stopped receiving shocks, that's reflected in the test phase here. When the animal goes back to the acquisition cage, the fear response comes back very strongly. Okay, so that means that the extinction phase actually did not make the animal unlearn what it had learned during acquisition. So it's not really extinction, it's something else, apparently. It's rather that it's learned something new. And you see that in a new cage, the behavior is somewhere in between. Okay, so the idea is that the animal might create this latent state that represents a cage in which the tone leads to pain. And then at extinction, cluster all those trials together with a different cause, a latent cause that where the tone does not lead to extinction. And if the animal does that, then going back to this new, to this old cage, the animal will know to associate this to the latent state that does cause pain. And so that will explain no extinction. Yeah.
You're calling this a latent state.
Yeah.
The state is the color of the box, so that seems like it's not latent.
Yeah, so here it's observable. I'm calling it latent because this is the idea is that there's a cause that's not tied to the actual representation of the physical nature of the box that is causing this rather than the box itself. And that's important because that means that if in other a different box the conditioned stimulus led to the unconditioned stimulus again, that could be clustered together too, with this latent cause. Okay, so if the idea here is that if extinction induces inference of a new latent cause, we should be able to prevent the return of fair by tricking the brain into modifying the acquisition latent cause. Okay, so that would be the idea that rather than creating a new latent cause here at extinction, you want to trick the brain to think that this is actually the same thing as this, in which case the two boxes would look different, but the cause would still be the same. Okay, so Sam and his colleagues try this by gradual extinction. So it looks like this. The animal is trained to fear the tone. And then during extinction, extinction is gradual instead of being sudden. So the tone will still cause shocks at the beginning, but less and less and less frequently over time, with the idea that if the change is slower, then the animal might not recognize this as a different latent cause. For comparison, there was a gradual reverse condition where the number of shocks was still the same, but the order was reversed, and regular extinction, which is just going straight from shocks to no shocks. Okay, so when they tested this in animals, what came out was that in the standard condition and in the reverse condition, we observed they observed the expected pattern, where when they came back to the original context, the fear response came back, but in the gradual case, it didn't renew. So that means that this time there had been unlearning rather than learning of something separate. Okay, so what I think this shows is that some of the previous principles that Sam was talking about in the first half was applied to learning the structure of the state space, generating latent causes that are what we can use as a state representation, structure representation, essentially trying to cluster our experiences based on the similarity of our interaction with the environment rather than the similarity of their perception. And we've seen in the first case that exact inference does not seem to capture human behavior very well, and that approximate algorithms do better in this case. Okay, any questions? Yeah.
So in this example, the problem was that the agent has like a really big or high-dimensional space. It has to simplify, right? Like I was curious about situations where you have to incorporate or integrate like many features of the environment at the same time, and when they can act like in concert. You know, for example, in social interactions, you have to pay attention to a number of things, right? Like voice, gender, context, content of the speech, situation, etc. And you have to gather all that information and in some way incorporate that to take an action, right? So I don't know, it's like you're not trying to simplify. I don't know the problem, you have to incorporate all at once. So I wonder if that's tractable kind of algorithm.
So I completely agree with you that simplifying is not always the answer, and that in often cases you actually need to represent the state space in a way that is captures the complexity of the environment. You still need to somehow make it so that it's that the state space is small enough to allow learning, and so that's a really complex question that I don't have a good answer to, but we'll be talking about a bit in the third part about hierarchy, some similar questions. Yeah. Yes?
So in the relational memory test that you just showed, there was the latent cause that you said was, as you said, in this case, it's observable. Can you give like an example of something similar where the latent cause is really not observable?
Yes, if you don't mind deferring to the third part, I'll be giving another example. But an example that, I mean, I can come up with one quickly, which is for example, I'm French, if you didn't notice with my accent. And I have this laptop that I bought in the US that has an English keyboard, and I have a French laptop that has a French keyboard. And I often plug in an American keyboard to either of the two laptops. And I have to start typing. and sometimes it's in French mode and sometimes it's in English mode. And so I can't usually observe directly which of the two modes I'm in, but I still need to be able to know how to interact with the environment. So that would be a situation in which there's a clear latent cause that I can't see immediately, and that constrains how I interact. There's a number of other examples you could come up with. Yeah. Yeah, so you would need to incorporate the shock in the model, for sure.
The color is not the cause.
No, the color is not the cause. Yeah, no, it's I think you use the colors as a, like for simplicity, right, for description here, more than
Information about the cause.
Yeah.
There are situations where animals ignore the color.
Mm-hmm.
It's not always the case that animals change their whenever the color changes.
Right. Yeah. That's something you'll see also in the third part. Yeah. So something that's unobservable might be partially observable. For example, you might there might be information about this, about what this latent cause is, but you might not know that immediately. Okay, so we talked about the input of the state space part of the problem. A similar question we could ask is about the output part of the problem, of the action state. And something that's important here is that whatever action you take might constrain what your next state is, which is a really important problem for exploring large environments. So this is an example that's taken from a paper by Neve and colleagues, where they take this grid world example where you have 4 different rooms, and where the agent needs to learn to go from a starting point to a goal repeatedly. Okay? So if you represent the actions here in the most basic sense, for example, one of 8 directions, it's going to take lots of steps to go anywhere in the maze, and so exploration is going to be very slow. So this is depicted by this graph here. That's assuming you just have 2 choices at each time, but to go deep into your exploration, you'll have to take many steps. Instead, if you use what's called options, which are temporally extended actions, so temporally extended local policies. For example, this one, a policy that tells you go to the door and consider that as a single action, then you're going to be exploring through this state much more quickly, because you're going to be able to jump in a single decision to a further point in the space. Okay? So options are defined as those policies that end at a given sub-policies that end at a given termination criterion that you can select the same way you would select an action. Okay? But they're extended, so they allow you to go further away. Okay, so the options are potentially very useful for exploring. So, for example, if you pick options with those 4 goals here, in this case, so the doors between the rooms, the simulations show that the agent is going to be able to learn much faster to reach their goal. So here this curve is with options, and this one is just with the primitive actions. But if you pick the wrong options, so if you pick options that are not adequate to either your environment or your goal, then that's going to work much less well. So this is an example where the options have goals at the windows here instead of at the doors. So the windows here are not going to help you move from one room to the next, and when you simulate the agent with those options plus actions, it performs much less well than with actions. Yes? Yes. So you could have goals. So if you define goals here, they're not going to represent your whole state space, right? So you still need to know what to do here. So that's not going to solve the problem. So defining the goals is very useful as, for example, a termination condition for an option. So saying like, okay, I'm going to define a policy that goes to the door, and that's going to be helpful. Sense? So the question of structural learning for options in this case, or for actions, for creating a good action space, becomes, well, how do I figure out what the good, useful options are? And in particular, how do I figure out what useful sub-goals might be? And as you might intuit from this graph, it's the idea that maybe bottlenecks in your problem space might be important sub-goals. A number of people have explored the idea of whether people actually structure their representation of state transitions in such a way that focuses on those goals that are bottlenecks. So, for example, Anna Shapiro and colleagues did this experiment where participants saw a string of shapes, one after the other. So it would see this one, then this one, then this one, etc. And they would be trained for 30 minutes or so to seeing those sequences with a covered task where they weren't supposed to learn transitions at all. And what they did not know was that there was a specific statistical structure to this sequence. So here, each node in this graph represents one of those symbols here. This graph is something that the participants don't see, but that the experimenters created so that there are bottlenecks in the transitions between the spaces, right? So this might be this symbol, and this might be this symbols, and so that means that all the sequences were drawn from of images were drawn from path through this graph. Okay, and so the question was, if people are exposed to these statistics of the environment, are they going to figure out what those bottlenecks are and potentially set them as goals for options? So that's what they found. After participants had learned this, they were shown again in a test phase new sequences and asked to parse this sequence where they thought that made sense. Okay? And the participants were more likely to parse the sequence at those transitions here, those orange transitions, compared to within community transitions, which seemed to indicate that they were sensitive to this presence of bottlenecks in the transition between spaces, states in the space. Okay, so this was taken. So this is purely observational in this case, and what researchers took one step further was asking whether people actually use this for decisions. So to make this the goal of options, and that's what Alex Solway and colleagues found. So they did a similar task in this case. The graph looks like this rather than the previous one, and the different items here represent different places in a city that the participants had to navigate, and participants had to figure out if an item was on their path between two items or not, and a number of other tests. And again, they did a number of clever experimental manipulations to show that people identified those two bottlenecks here. So the size of the gray circle here indicates how much more likely they were to identify this as a bottleneck than the rest. And used it to decide how to navigate from one place to the other. So that's support in favor of people using this to create useful options. So something that's really interesting here is that not only do people create these new actions, so this state space this action space over which they can learn. But there's an important feature here that's hierarchy. So what people will do is they might, in state 1, they might choose an action, a low-level action, and then in state 2, they might decide to pick an option. And once they decide to pick an option, they stick with it for an extended period of time. So they pick the actions selected by the policy of this option for a while. And once this option is terminated, for example, reaching the door of the room, they go back to picking actions. But within having selected an option, an extended policy, you still have to select actions. Okay, so there's temporal hierarchy in the action space. Essentially, you can subdivide any action into finer grained and finer grained representation of the actions. So the example of making coffee is a good one. Like you can define an action of making coffee, which you can decompose into turning on the machine and putting grain in it and getting a cup and pressing the button. And each of those steps can also be decomposed in many sub-steps, etc. Okay? And so there's this hierarchy that's really important in the representation of the action space for structured learning. And decision-making and learning occur in parallel at multiple hierarchical levels in parallel. Here I just say 2 because that's just to represent it, but it could be more than that. An option could itself select an option, etc. Okay, so we're in this situation where for option, or what's called the hierarchical reinforcement learning framework, participants use an RL algorithm to select an option in response to a stimulus. And once they select an option, they use this options policy to select actions in response to stimuli. Okay, so you have 2 imbricated reinforcement learning processes, and there's a hierarchical dependence on them. This process only happens so long as the option that's temporally extended is in place. Okay, so that's going to lead us to the third part of this talk, the importance of hierarchy in structured learning. Do we have any questions before that? Yes, that's exactly what I'm going to talk about right now. Thank you. Any other questions? Mm-hmm.
Kind of like a way of thinking about decomposing like actions and tasks. Does it interface, or like does your modeling interface at all with like the ACR model, Anderson, like because that's like what I'm more familiar with in terms of like skill decomposition.
You know, I don't know. I don't know the answer to that. I don't know if ACR incorporates this kind of notion. Yeah, sorry. Does anyone know?
It's a little different. It's not an infinity.
Right. Yeah.
But I mean, it's in a similar spirit of temporally extended actions. But some of those, the skills, cognitive skills in that, right? So they're not necessarily temporally extended.
Do your models like predict? I mean, I guess I can talk to you.
Sure. Just to be clear, this was not my work. This was other people's work. Yeah. Okay. So hierarchy is really important. We gave an example in this temporally extended sense, and now we're going to give examples both at within the state and action space representations. I'm going to go back to my computer examples because they're very real life for me. So the idea here is that if you know how to use this computer, you might still need to learn a different set of rules for using this computer. Okay? So you might have a Linux set of behavior and a Mac set of behavior, but once you have those 2 sets of rules, you're going to be able to very flexibly use many computers, many new computers. So if you get this one or this one or this one, you'll be able to immediately immediately reapply the skills you've learned in the first case to not have to relearn and to instead generalize what you know and apply it immediately. Okay, and the question is how we come to represent those rules in a way that's helpful. So if you take those examples here, you might have you might want to figure out how to kill MATLAB in a Linux environment, and this would be your action, or how to find your PowerPoint in Linux, and this would be the other action you would take. And then same in a macOS environment, which would be a completely different set of actions in this environment. Okay, so you could represent those complex compound stimuli, kind of going back to your question. Here they're just two-dimensional, but they're still more complex, as four different situations independent, and just learn the four different associations between those four different situations and those four different actions. What I'll make the point about is that what's much more likely to happen is that instead you'll use your Linux computer as a context to make you select a set of Linux rules. So you'll say like, okay, this is my Linux computer, I'm going to use Linux methods, and that includes responding this way to those two situations. And then you might create your your Mac rule. Okay, so this is where we're going to have hierarchy, right? We're going to select high-level, more abstract actions that are a set of behaviors that are then going to constrain lower-level stimulus action sets of behaviors. This does not have to be temporally extended the way options are. Okay, so in this case, you would have still those same four actions at the bottom, but this time you can represent those stimuli as two different stimuli, and you can call those two computers the two contexts, so that's a more abstract state space. And we call this kind of rules, we call them task sets, sets of stimulus action associations that you select in response to the context. Okay, so the hierarchy here is that you use abstract state space of context to select an abstract set of rules, task sets, that then constrain the selection of lower level stimulus action associations. In the lab, we do this with much simpler situations like colors and shapes, like this. Okay? So this is, again, I'm trying to draw the parallel to the options because I think it's very related to the options framework of hierarchical reinforcement learning, whereby you'll have a learning algorithm that tells you how to select a set of rules in response to a context. And this, having selected this set of rules, is going to constrain the lower level learning and decision mechanism, the less abstract learning and decision mechanism. Contrary to options, though, it's not temporally extended this time. Okay, you could also just represent this with RL policies. So you could have learn to represent the value of a stimulus and an action and derive a policy out of this, the value of a context and a task set and derive a policy out of it. And the important aspect is that there is this hierarchy that constrains the lower level. Okay, so I wanted to test whether participants actually learn this kind of hierarchical abstract actions, task sets. So to do that, I tested participants on a simple learning task where they would see a stimulus. Here, the stimuli are 1 of 3 digits. So one, for example, in this case, pick one of 4 choices that's represented by the 4 boxes and get feedback. So here, they picked the left and they didn't get rewarded. Another stimulus, get rewarded in this case. You see here that the context changed. I picked another action, got rewarded, etc., etc. So they would go through a lot of trials like this, and what we constrained was that the valid task set to learn about at a given point would sometimes change. Okay, so here, what would give them points, probabilistically, was picking those actions for those 3 stimuli, whereas in this new episode here, it would be picking those 3 actions for those 3 stimuli. Okay, and we made sure that context could change independently of task set changes. Okay, so that would be like going from France to Belgium, but still speaking French, and then going from Belgium to Germany and having to speak German. Okay, so the experiment went like that. We had multiple contexts associated to each task set. Participants got probabilistic feedback so that it wasn't obvious when an episode changed, and they had to try to win as many points as possible. And after that, we tested them on whether, on new contexts. So we asked if, in a test phase, if we go back to context 1, are they going to be able to reuse task set 1 easily? If we go to a completely new context 7, that requires them to use task set 2, are they going to be able to reuse this task set 2? So if they have indeed created task set 2 as an entity, as an abstract action that they can select, then they should be able to select task set 2 and so on, and not have to completely relearn it, which would mean that they should be able to learn this faster than a new context with a new task set. So that's what we observed. Essentially, in this transfer condition here, participants relearn much faster than they did in this green condition here, where they had to learn a completely new task set, which supported our idea that participants are able to create those more abstract hierarchical actions that we call task sets or roles. Okay, so in this case, the context, the state space, the abstract state space of context is observable. So we also ask whether participants can do that without any observable cue as to what the context, as to what the current asset was. So we did that by doing exactly the same experiment, just with no background change in this case. Okay, so there was absolutely no cue that things might be changed. And we observed essentially the same results here. That's in the red condition here. That represents a situation where they could reuse previously learned task sets. Participants were able to learn faster than in conditions where they were not able to reuse previously learned task sets. Okay, so in this space, this is going back to your question, where here we have a completely unobservable latent cause. That's which episode are we currently in that conditions which task set we need to select. Okay, so the idea here is that participants, again, have those 2 learning processes at 2 hierarchical level, one letting them select task sets, and the other one letting them select actions, condition on what the current task set is. And the question is, how can we model this? How can we do this? And the key question is how do we create this task set space? How do we figure out what the relevant task set space is? The participants don't know in advance that how many task sets there might be, how many hypotheses there might be. So this is where you might see non-parametric based kind of models come into play. We took a more bottom-up approach though to this modeling. We tried to see what we should add to something simple to make it able to perform this task. So if you start with a simple reinforcement learning model, it's that takes a stimulus, figures out the value of a stimulus action, and then to pick an action, and then updates this with classic RL from the outcome. The model is able to learn the task and adjust to changes in contingencies in the task. But it's never going to be able to reuse past information because it's going to learn as it goes. Okay? So what we call the actor task set, the current policy in use, is continuously being updated. Okay? So that could not have accounted for data. So instead, we tried a version where, in addition to this, we monitor our uncertainty about the outcome. So we say, with the current actor, I'm expecting to get rewarded if I pick action 1 for stimulus 1. And if all of a sudden my predictions are not being met, then my confidence that this is the right thing to do is going to drop. And once this confidence drop, this reliability here drops, I'm going to say, okay, I detected a change point. I detected that something changed in the environment, and I should just reset my values. Okay, so that's going to make switching faster, but you still will forget what happened in the past. Okay, so you create a new task set each time. So instead we said, well, we need to have the ability to monitor multiple task sets in parallel, so we could have a fixed number of hypotheses, about different rules that are useful in this environment, and simply monitor their reliability online, and use this reliability to arbitrate both learning and decision-making. This is inspired by multiple model-based reinforcement learning by Doe and Kawado. Okay, and so the actor set is selected based on the reliability. So this has the problem that it has a fixed number, which participants shouldn't know. You shouldn't know ahead of time how many behaviors you're going to need, throughout your life, essentially. Okay, so the model we designed is inspired by Chinese restaurant kind of processes, trying to allow us to both cluster together information, but also create new clusters as needed. So this model tracks its uncertainty and the reliability of multiple alternative task sets at the same time, but also gives us the opportunity to create new task sets. And the task set creation obeys two constraints where we track the reliability of the task sets, but by default we keep using the same one, and we monitor only a bounded number of task sets so that we may forget other task sets. So to select the actor task set, for example, if our bound is 3, representing, for example, working memory limits, you might have a number of task sets that you've encountered in the past, but you're going to only be monitoring the last 3. And this is how likely it is that the current task set, that each of the 3 task sets is currently the one that you should be using. And so as long as the reliability is high, you should be selecting this task set. So here, task set 1, task set 2, or task set 3, for example. But as soon as you get into a situation where you're not confident about any of the task sets, which you could decide with a threshold, and in our case we just decided with a 0.5 threshold, you might give yourself the opportunity to create a new task set, to probe for the opportunity of the need to create a new task set. So in this case, the model creates a new probe actor that is responsible for decision and learning, while at the same time monitoring what's present in the buffer. So you essentially enter a high-level exploration period. So before that, you were exploiting previous task sets. Now you're exploring the possibility of a new task set while checking whether the other task sets might also be valid. And this exploration period can either end in you thinking that the current episode corresponds well to a previous task set, in which case you can reactivate it and so reuse this knowledge you had of this previous task set, or decide that no, this environment necessitates creation of a new rule. So for example, if you've never used a Windows machine before, you might need to create a whole new set of rules for this one, in which case the probe actor becomes a new task set that you're using. Okay, so it has strong similarities to a Chinese restaurant process like clustering, because it has this flexibility of unknown size, but also this possibility to cluster things together based on how similarly you should act in different environments. And so those clusters index the task set rules, which provide the ability to generalize task sets to new contexts, and but also to create task sets as needed. And our inference process is a very approximate version that's tracking uncertainty over an unbounded hypothesis space, this abstract asset, that defines this discrete high-level exploration periods. Okay, so when we tested all those models, the Pro model was the only one that captured the behavior qualitatively well. This is what you can see here. It did so much better than an optimal model that was defined with perfect Bayesian inference over the generative model that we used for the task. Okay, so again, it seems that this approximation in the inference is fairly important. And it's making computation much less costly. Any questions? Yeah.
You suggested a long-term memory storage task set that only kept a buffer, which presumably has something to do with working memory capacity. If you ran this task in a scanner, would you be able to detect the change from, let's say, I'm now trying to call a task set that I committed, or detect change points between task sets?
So if I run this task in a what?
In a fMRI.
Oh, yes. Yeah, we did. Let me give you the punchline. So essentially, we did, and that was the great thing about this algorithm, is that it defines those very specific points where you switch away from using a default behavior, or you switch out of an exploratory behavior towards either reusing something you've learned before or towards creating something new. And those three discrete time points are really model-defined rather than behavior-defined, led to really fairly different patterns in the brain. So this is the pattern you get when in this rejection event, which is rejecting the probe task set, so reusing an old task set, you seem to reactivate this lateral prefrontal cortex region. If you instead, so it's just, whereas when you switch in, so go away from your default behavior towards an exploratory period, this dorsal ACC region comes into line, potentially indicating need for more control or something. And I didn't put in my slides this one, but this one has a fairly specific pattern too. Okay, this, again, assumed temporal stability. This model assumed that by default you exploit the current task set for the next trial, so it's assumed that there is, that the task set doesn't change too often, and that's how partly you learn task sets. And so I was next curious about whether such structural learning could occur even without this temporal constraint. Okay, so I used the same, like a variant of the same experimental design where participants learned stimulus-action associations. In this case, the feedback was deterministic. And this is what they learned in the learning phase, just those four colored shapes with those four actions, and all four randomly interleaved. Okay, and then I tested them in the testing phase with four new shapes, potentially sharing the shapes, but new colors. So the idea here is that if this is a task that during the learning phase could perfectly well be learned with no structure whatsoever. You could just reprint those four stimuli independently of each other and learn those four associations. Instead, you could use the color as a context that constrains the selection of the task set, and this time the task set does not care about the color anymore. and will select actions in response to the shapes. Okay. What's interesting in this case is that you could structure this task hierarchically this way, in which case you might see that the blue color here has the same task set as task set 1, but not the green one. But you could also structure this task the other way around. You could use the shapes as a context and the colors as a stimulus, in which case there shouldn't be any benefit. So you can say it better this way. If you structure with color, then you can cluster together those two contexts around the same task set, and that means that in this blue condition you should be able to generalize your previous knowledge, which you should not be able to do in the green context. So using a CRP-like approximate model, again, we can make those predictions that learning in a test phase should be better for those contexts that corresponds to old task sets, not new task sets, if some participants cluster represent this task this way. So we found that significantly. It's a small effect, but it's been replicated many times now. And what's more interesting is that we should predict transfer in this situation where color is used as a context, but not in that situation where shape is used as a context. And we can try to make this prediction based on whether there is a task set switch cost associated with colors or with shapes. Task set switch cost is a really well-established finding in the literature. And so indeed, that's what we found. Participants who had higher context and shape switch cost showed very strong transfer, whereas the ones who had higher shape than color switch cost showed no transfer. Okay, so that showed that participants were all structuring hierarchically this task, even though in this case it was not forced by the temporal nature of the task or not forced by any way of simplifying the task. This is actually a more complex representation than having a flat representation. We actually replicated this version of this finding in 8-month-old infants, which seems to show that this is a really robust phenomenon in humans. We replicated it twice. And so what this finding shows is that humans seem to create multiple state spaces, so those stimuli and context, multiple action spaces with actions and task sets at multiple hierarchical abstraction levels in parallel. And that this seems to be a default behavior, even in the absence of immediate gain. Given time constraints, I'm going to skip the next few slides. Okay. So just to the so I've been trying to show that task set learning is a great example of hierarchical structure learning. Although there are many others, but that is not necessarily constrained by a hierarchical nature of the environment, which is what's important. There are many other people who have looked at this, and unfortunately I don't have time to do them justice right now. Okay, I'd like to go quickly into this part of the talk. We've talked about structuring the state space and the action space, and about doing this hierarchically. And in this part, I'd like to talk about this aspect of the diagram here, where you learn actually how to learn the algorithm, and even more so, how to potentially how to represent all of this together. So there are actually really old findings about learning how to learn, which is finding the best representation of everything at the same time. So the state space, the action space, but also the algorithm that will work best with those spaces. So for example, Hallow had those really cool findings in 1949, and really fun to read paper that are much more stylistically engaging than our modern papers, where he, for example, says that his participants were another type of primates, 4-year-old children, which is a funny thing to read these days. Okay, so he tested with monkeys, very simple learning where the monkey had to pick between two shapes and figure out under which one food was. And the monkey had 6 trials, and one of the shapes predicted reward and the other one not, and the position was randomly interleaved. And what he showed was that at the beginning the monkey would learn fairly slowly, but the more and the more and the more the monkey was exposed to the same problem with completely new shapes each time, that's the key part, the better the monkey became, up to the point where the monkey was perfect, right? So random at the first trial, and then asymptote at the second trial. Okay, so that's really important because this is something that that really shows that even if the monkey did not experience, so the monkey might have picked the correct shape in the first trial and gotten reward, or he might have picked the wrong shape in the first trial and not gotten reward, and without having experienced it, still know to pick the other shape for reward in the next trial. Okay, so that indicates that the monkey has really integrated somehow the structure of the problem that it's being shown, and is able to use it in such a way that makes him learn much faster. So more recent work shows similar findings in a more subtle, at a more subtle level in humans. So, for example, Aprova Bendery and David Bader show that if you learn how to handle a task, so for example, if you learn how to decide what to keep in working memory and what not to keep in working memory in a task, you're going to be able to bring that structure with you to the next environment. So in this task, they would see that there was a context, this number here, that determined whether you should pick the action with the A or the G, or whether you should pick the action with one of those two shapes. Okay? In a context-free condition, the context that conditioned which of the two dimensions to pay attention to was first, which meant that you would see this context, you would know that you had to pay attention to the letter, so you could encode the letter here, not pay attention to this, and then pick the right answer here. In the context last condition, the number arrived last, which meant that if you saw A and pi first, you had to encode both into working memory, and then use the context here to decide. Okay, so this was a different set of working memory encoding processes. Some participants did the two same conditions in a row. Some did them in different orders. And what they were looking for was whether having learned to solve this task in a certain way that's optimized for the condition would give them a benefit. And that's what they found. Here in the early trials of the task, participants that went from context last, where you had to encode everything, to context first, where you could filter out what you needed to remember, were penalized compared to other participants. So showing that they had somehow built a strategy about how to solve this task that they were able to transfer and port through. Okay. Another version of learning how to learn is learning to tune parameters of your algorithm. So Tim Behrens and colleagues developed this task where it's a 2-arm bandit probabilistic, where participants had to track the probability to figure out which of the actions to pick, and which of the two bandits was valid stayed for the same for a while and then changed fast for a while and then became stable for a while again. And they showed that optimally you should adjust how quickly you learn as a function of this volatility. So the quicker the environment change, the faster you should learn to be able to catch up on the environment. And they show that participants seem to do that. So when the environment is stable, the learning rate is lower, making them integrate over a longer period of times. When it's volatile, they learn faster. Okay, so I've been over those 4 learning blocks, those 4 building blocks of structured learning that show that we can structure many aspects of the learning problem, the state space, the action space. We can make them hierarchical, and we can tune many different aspects of the learning algorithms. Okay, and some of the principles that on which this relies is saying that you can probably simplify your problem and reduce the curse of dimensionality in some way, or explore faster with options, for example. But also by creating those abstract action spaces, options or task set rules, you're able to generalize and learn more flexibly. And this also allows you to explore better, or explore at a more abstract level, where with a new computer, you're not going to explore individual actions at a time, but rather a whole set of Linux or Mac behavior. Okay. And something that I've only brushed upon, but I think is really important, is the fact that in some of those cases, participants actually complexify the problem, make it more complex and more costly to learn for no apparent good reason. And so by creating more abstract or hierarchical representations, it seems like they're going to pay a cost at learning slower, but that having made this structure representation later gives them much more flexibility and better ability to generalize and learn faster. Okay, so this seems to represent a bias that we have for learning structure, and that probably represents the statistics of the environment, that it is usually useful to structure, because you can often probably generalize your behavior in many different environments. Okay, and others have pointed out this too in simpler settings. Okay, so I'd just like to very quickly brush over the last part, in my last 8 minutes, about how the brain does it. So it's good that it's going to be quick. But before that, are there any questions? Okay, so this is all. As you've seen, there's many different aspects to structured learning, and so we probably shouldn't expect there to be a single answer to how structured learning occurs in the brain, and even if we're limiting ourselves to the type of structured learning I talked about rather than Sam. I'd like to just point out a few things that have come up repeatedly in the literature that are directions of research currently. So, for example, for the representation of the structure of a state space, there's a few, I wouldn't call them competing, but potential hypotheses out there. So, for example, there's been a recent work pointing the role of the orbitofrontal cortex, the hippocampus, the amygdala, and even lateral prefrontal cortex. Task sets seem to, in hierarchy and hypothesis, seems to fairly reliably recruit lateral prefrontal cortex. Medial prefrontal cortex and anterior cingulate cortex seem to be very important in monitoring your uncertainty, but also probably in many other aspects. And the basal ganglia, in particular, the networks, the loop networks between the cortex and the basal ganglia are probably very important for learning, potentially at multiple hierarchical levels in parallel. Okay. Now I have 5 minutes. I need to decide what I skip. So I'll just, I'd just like to talk quickly about this. So there's been much work pointing to the fact that lateral prefrontal cortex probably represents a hierarchy of abstraction with a posterior to anterior gradient. Okay. And so that could correspond to our, at the lowest order of abstraction, just simple sensory motor associations, and at a higher level of abstractions, this second layer of hierarchical structural learning, for example, context rule associations. And then if there's more orders, we haven't really looked into them yet. What is also known is that the cortical basal ganglia loops that go through the thalamus and then back there are fairly repeatable circuits that implement some kind of reinforcement learning process. Okay. So Michael Frank and myself, we said that maybe if we have a network like this that takes states as inputs and actions as outputs, and that can learn through reinforcement learning to select actions, we might have one that starts that starts in premotor cortex, and one that starts in prefrontal cortex, and that because there are also those hierarchical dependencies between those loops, this higher level loop might be a mechanism by which we learn to select task sets at a hierarchical level that then constrains the selection of actions in response to stimuli at the lower level. Okay, so so we designed such hierarchical neural network in Emergent, so using a biologically plausible network. So you probably don't want the details here. This is exactly the same as before. For example, a context here, a color, learns in those loops to select a task set, uses reward prediction errors to do so, and then constrains the representation of the inputs to a second loop here that uses those inputs and the same reward prediction error to learn to select actions. So what's really interesting here is that it's a purely reinforcement learning, no inference, no model prediction, no nothing model, just more free reinforcement learning with biologically realistic architecture that is able to reproduce many of the behavioral results, some of which I showed you and some of which I did not show you, but this one being the generalization of a task set to a new context before. Okay? So what this shows us is that reinforcement learning network repeated in pattern with different inputs from different areas of the cortex might be a way to implement some aspect, at least, of structural learning. And there's been some evidence out there that this might be a plausible algorithm indeed. For example, by showing that the signals for reward prediction errors in the brain, measured either in fMRI or in EEG, so fMRI here and EEG here, are sensitive to the structure of the state space. So a model that incorporates structural learning explains those signals better than one that doesn't. And there's been even evidence for multiple such learning signals in the brain previously. So that's a possible candidate for how the brain might approximate things like structural learning without needing to do complex MCMC or Bayesian inference. Okay, so I'm going to wrap up. To summarize, I think we've learned that both the structure of the environment and the structure of our interactions with the environments are things that are very important. And that structural learning, even though it's short and costly, can be very long-term efficient, providing generalization, providing better, faster exploration in new environments. And that probably because it is potentially so beneficial in the long run, it seems to be occurring by default even in as young as 8-month-old infants. And another important aspect is that we have, like, lots of people are looking at this, but we still don't really understand well how the brain is doing all this. And so, feel free to work on this. And yeah, that's it. Any questions? Yes.
So you, in your work on task sets, the task set is a discrete object that doesn't have any structure internal to it. There was at one point on a slide, you didn't talk about it, but you had a task set being created in a mixture of other task sets. So I assume that's just like the task set is a queue function and you're just doing combining whatever that is.
Yeah.
That seems to suggest if you apply that principle more generally, rather than just always creating a new task set, you could say, okay, well, context is multidimensional, and at any moment I'm going to be assigning some weight to all these different contexts. Like, so right now I'm in a context of being at a conference. I'm also in the context of asking a question.
So yes and no. So you're right in one way and wrong in one way. Well, wrong. Sorry. I mean, we have evidence against what you're saying in another way. So definitely this strict hierarchy is way too restrictive. And for example, something that I haven't shown you in my slides at this point, but definitely happens is that you could have a task set that you've created here, like saying, for example, press left for the circle and right for the triangle, and later on learn 2 new actions in this green context, and so append those new associations to this task set. So that's going to make this task set bigger. So the task set is an object in itself, but its content might evolve. So that's saying that it's more flexible. This can work really well in the current state of the model, and actually makes predictions that are validated in participants. So the participants, if they learn this, can immediately transfer it to the other context that reuses this task set. That being said, what I haven't tested yet, although I'm in the process of, is how you might recombine bits and parts of different task sets in different environments. And that's very likely to happen. What we have evidence is not happening is this probabilistic mixture of multiple task sets. So if you have some uncertainty about which task set you're using now, and decide to make your policy a mixture of multiple task sets based on how likely they are, this actually just does not work well with the data. So this is, I didn't explain this in detail, but this is this model that just does not capture behavior well. It's missing. It's missing the fact that participants seem to be making a deterministic decision of which task set to use rather than mixing their policies. Yeah. Other questions? Thank you.